So let's talk about, I guess, just the question that was posed to you initially about neoliberals and anti-maskers and the influence that they seem to be having on policy at the government level. What's your take on that?
Well, it's certainly surprising to a lot of people that such a small minority group of people who are opposed to stringent public health measures are, seem to be having an inordinate amount of influence on public decision makers. And it all has to do with the fact that it's not public opinion that sways leaders, or at least not only public opinion that does. It's also their sense of what the community as a whole will withstand. How much do they think the average Albertan will take when it comes to public health measures?
And so obviously there seems to be, like you say, a disparity between what the average Albertan really is and what the perception of an average Albertan would be.
Yeah, there is a disjunction between what we find in surveys tells us the average Albertan thinks and does versus what Albertans think the average Albertan thinks and does, right? And in our exercises, we've asked people to talk to us a bit about who they think the average Albertan is. And it's almost always somebody who works in agriculture, or a farmer or a cowboy, or somebody who works in the rigs, usually a middle-aged white man. And by examining how they think that average Joe, that Joe Albertan, thinks and feels about matters of public policy like pandemic preparedness, we can really gain insight into what our leaders are thinking, because they have Joe in mind when they're making decisions as well.
So how does this mythical Joe, this Joe who maybe no longer is truly the average Albertan, how is it that he holds so much sway?
Well, Joe is planted in the minds of all kinds of different Albertans. We've had focus groups across this province, didn't matter where people were from, what their ethnicity was, what their income level, what their gender was. They all seem to have this conception that the average Joe Albertan is this cowboy, farmer, or rig worker. What we know from our research is that by knowing that that is what the average Albertan is, that's the myth of what the average Albertan is, it actually puts boundaries on what they think is acceptable to say or do. So if Joe won't put up with a PST, then I'm not going to stick my neck out and propose one or support one. Or if Joe's priorities are about economics, jobs, and pipelines, then maybe my priorities have to take a back seat because there's no alternative, it seems, but to go along with Joe.
Yeah, so I know that you guys, you created a little bit more robust profile of what Joe would look like beyond the mask. We'll talk about the mask and the lockdown in a second, but like maybe just a little bit more clarity on who Joe is on key topics.
Yeah, we've been traveling across the province asking people to tell us a little bit about average Joe Albertan. We know, for example, that he's middle-aged, he's not older, he's not the Marlboro man, but he's the Marlboro man's kid, right? So whereas Joe Sr. might have gone to church every Sunday, Joe Jr., the average Albertan today, only goes to church on Easter, Christmas, weddings, funerals, right? So we know that about him. We know he's typically got kids. He may or may not be divorced. He likes his hockey. He likes his beer. He likes his Tim Hortons. And he likes his government to stay out of his way for the most part. There is one exception, though, and this brings us to the pandemic policy issue. Joe connects with social policy issues when they affect him directly. So if Joe knows somebody who, for example, has had issues with opioid abuse, Joe is more attuned to those issues and turns away actually from the notions of a personal responsibility to say that, this person needs help. Joe, if he's affected directly by this stuff, it actually will change his mind.
So again, so that's then similar to the lockdown. The opioid thing essentially translates to that, and that if he's personally affected, he's going to give it down.
Yeah, we're going to be going out in the field again virtually in the new year to talk to people about how they think average Joe Albertan would react to pandemic restrictions. And I think Joe, from what I know of him, talking with a lot of participants, will be conflicted. On one hand, he doesn't want government to be in his way and making decisions on behalf of himself or his family. We've certainly seen that rhetoric reflected in the Premier's remarks. But at the same time, he does relate to people on an emotional level if those people have been influenced by a particular public policy issue. So as we see, unfortunately, more people going to hospital, more people ending up in ICU and dying, average Joe Albertan is more likely to know these people and connect with them. So that's why I think Joe is not this monolithic, mythical person. He actually does change his mind when he's confronted with actual personal experiences.
So how is it then that, I mean, the government latches on to this Joe? Like, I mean, again, you're absolutely right. The premier definitely seemed to be referencing him with great frequency yesterday, and certainly over the course of the pandemic. But that Joe seems to have changed his mind, at least according to the survey. So, like, how is it that the government is still latching on to what Joe believes, even though it seems to be politically dicey for them to do that?
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that in our research, we're talking to Albertans from all walks of life. And according to the Premier's stories, he seems to be talking with the same types of people all the time. We hear all about small business owners that he's talked to, people from faith-based communities that he's talked to. We talk to people from all different communities, and they all have a very similar conception of who Joe is. And in that sense, I think we have a broader idea of who Joe Albertan is. And maybe some people have an outdated notion of what Joe will accept or what Joe is motivated by, but we think we've got a good finger on the pulse of Joe, of who Joe Albertan is and what he would do or think.
So that you don't sound optimistic that cooler heads are going to prevail, and that the will of the average Joe is going to prevail.
Yeah, that's the thing about the average Joe. The average Joe is not like his father, Joe Sr., where he was, in his rural community and didn't interact with anybody from across the spectrum or from other parts of Alberta, Canada, or the world. Joe Jr. is actually pretty worldly. When we ask him, for example, how he feels about doctors, nurses, public servants, he said that we've had the participants say, well, Joe's mother was a teacher, or Joe's partner is a nurse, right? So there's a sense that I think it's an outdated sense that Joe Albertan sees the world in left and right terms, particularly, or public sector versus private sector terms. I think he knows people, and that's the thing about Joe. If Joe knows you, if Joe knows your concerns, if your concerns touch him in some way, Joe's actually a pretty empathetic guy, not like his dad, right? So I think we misjudge the mood of Albertans, or the political culture of Alberta to think that Joe Albertan is in it for himself. He's not. He's actually a pretty empathetic guy if he gets to know people who are facing different challenges. And if there was any one time when we all seem to be going through a collective experience together, it's during a pandemic. So Joe knows people who have been sent to hospital. Joe knows people who work in healthcare, or teachers that are now being thrust into trying to figure out new ways of teaching students. So Joe can relate to that in a way that I don't think previous generations of average Albertans have.
Do you think they were clinging perhaps to Joe Sr. a little bit because of outside perspective? Perhaps, in the sense that, the way that Canada thinks about us is Joe Sr., right?
Yeah, well, that's the thing about political culture. It's not just the stories we tell ourselves, but it's the stories we hear being told about us, right? That's what surprised us from our research. We expected our participants in our focus groups to identify the Marlborough Man, Joe Sr., as being the average Albertan, when he was actually much younger. When we asked them, who does politics revolve around in this province? Who is Joe Albertan? They're telling us it's a 35-year-old man with young kids, right? Not this older gentleman. I think the rest of Canada has this image of Alberta being. So there is a little bit of difference there. And I think the rest of Canada needs to catch up with Alberta's conception of itself in that way. But I think we also need to take a hard look to see whether is Joe Albertan the way, like the myth of Joe Albertan, really the average Albertan? Surveys tell us no. The focus group tables that we've gathered across this province show that we don't have Joe showing up, right? It's not that we can't find Joe. Joe's out there, but Joe doesn't look like the average Albertan from an individual perspective. And that's the fascinating part about our research.
Yeah, well, I think Joe has Twitter now, so at least I'm starting to see some of that. Joe Jr., not Joe Sr.
That's the interesting thing, though, right? So we have a premier who admitted last night he actually tunes into his own Facebook feed and takes advice from people that way. From our research, I'm not sure that Joe Albertan actually hangs out on Facebook pages of politicians. What we've heard consistently is that Joe doesn't like politics, right? Joe doesn't go to rallies. Joe doesn't go onto Facebook pages and register his complaints about public policy. Quite frankly, Joe doesn't have time for that stuff. He wants government and politics to stay out of his life so he can focus on things that are important to him, usually his family, his favorite hockey team, and his favorite beer. And it's almost, he's looking for easy solutions in a way that help us to move past those kind of divisions. He has no time for polarization either. Joe just wants to live his life. And to an extent, I think that's what's being reflected in public policy today, and that we're trying to let Joe live his life without masking or without the inability to host a private gathering and so on. But the flip side of that is Joe actually is an integrated member of his community. And once he starts to see people being hospitalized, passing away, unfortunately, because of this disease, or being burned out as a public health official, that's when I think we'll start to see the mood of Alberta change.
Now, there you go. The Joe Jr. is a responsible libertarian.
Yeah. I mean, as on a side note, I mean, you'll have progressives that will malign him for that, right? So we asked point blank in some of these focus groups. So that's Joe. How does Joe feel about a pride parade in his community? And most of the participants said, Joe doesn't care. Joe's probably not going to go. He in his mind probably has better things to do, but he's not going to stand there on the sidelines and hold up a sign saying, get out of my town. Joe Sr. might have, right? And I think a lot of progressives look at that as not going far enough, that Joe should not be staying home. Joe should be part of the parade. Joe should be cheering this on. And I think eventually we might get there if we believe in a linear view of the development of inclusiveness in society. But for now, I think the common ground between Joe and progressives is, a willingness to let everyone live the way that they want to live, right? And not let government get in the way of that either way. And that's where I think average Joe is pushing away from this old line of social conservatism and neoliberalism that we're seeing more prominently in this government than we've seen in the past.
So I just want to make sure that I got it all down. So just walk me a little bit, just in terms of how you built this, what the focus groups, what the research looked like.
Yeah, so I mean, we demoed it over an entire summer, trying to come up with the right types of activities, and we stumbled onto one by accident almost when we started to think about, how can we connect with people to understand the values of Alberta society? And we use a technique called personification. It's pretty straightforward. We ask people to draw us an Albertan, right? Most people, when you say that, have an idea of something in their mind, and we just asked our participants to write it down. So most of them would draw a cowboy or a farmer or an oil worker. And then we'd ask the participants collectively to come up with a backstory for these individuals that they've created. So what do they do? What do they do on weekends? What are their family situation, their work situation, and so on. And from those backstories, we start to create this persona of the average Joe Albertan. We ask the participants, does politics revolve around Joe? And there's a little bit of discussion around that, but most of them agree that politics seem to be governed around what everybody thinks Joe wants to do or Joe won't do. So we develop our focus group activities around that notion. We ask participants not their own personal opinions, but rather, what would Joe think? What would Joe do? So would Joe find this political cartoon funny? How would Joe react if the government brought in a new policy that established a new provincial sales tax, for example? Give Joe a blank map of Canada. What kinds of things would he write on it, right? And we see them write, Ontario is the center of the universe, Quebec is a bunch of spoiled brats, and so on. I mean, the fact that our participants come to such quick consensus on what Joe would say or do suggests the political culture is pretty strong, because our participants aren't Joe. We don't see cowboys, rig workers, and farmers around the table for the most part. We have had a few. But everybody, no matter what their background is, seems to have a very good idea of who Joe is. A lot of them know a Joe. And a lot of them actually disagree with Joe on all of these points. But they are still reticent to raise those concerns because they think Joe won't put up with that. So regardless of where they stand on the political spectrum, they're less likely to raise their concerns or see it themselves as a priority or a possibility, because Joe's ideas form those boundaries of what's acceptable in our society. And that's political culture. And that's what we're trying to study through Common Ground.
Cool stuff. Although I probably don't have to clarify that we're not talking about Joe Cece. I probably don't have to make that explicit.
we haven't, and that's, it's funny you say that, because we only had one or two people draw politicians.
Hmm.
And the politician that they drew was Ralph. And these were a lot of older participants, but they drew Ralph Klein. One drew Peter Lougheed. So there is some affinity for politicians when they say who is an Albertan. Some people do identify politicians as being that, but not many.
Oh, interesting. Well, I mean, certainly Ralph Klein did exude that Joe Senior sort of attitude, I think, for most of us.
Yeah, and well, it's interesting because Ralph Klein used to talk about Martha and Henry, right?
Yep.
And who are Martha and Henry but the embodiment of Alberta political culture? Maybe that's a good way to think about it. Today, we're not finding people drawing Martha and Henry. We're finding them drawing Martha and Henry's kid. And that's seen as being the average Joe in society. And there's a lot of space between social conservative views, for example, and pure libertarian views that Martha and Henry held, and a more, what I would say, a more worldly or a more educated, more connected Joe Jr., who thinks about the world in a slightly more nuanced way.
Well, thank you for dropping the Martha and Henry giving birth to Joe Jr. line. I'm going to absolutely use that one. That's money. Anything else that you want to shed some light on, just that we didn't touch on pertaining to the convo that we're having?
No, I think it's important for us to not look at the development of public policy through purely ideological lens or purely through what public opinion tells us. There are these other forces at play, including the underlying values or the perception of what the underlying values of the community are, because that tells us what are the boundaries for acceptable action. And this government has a very clear view of what's acceptable to the average Joe Albertan, and it doesn't necessarily match with public opinion. That doesn't make it bad necessarily, but it does highlight that the development of public policy is far more complex than just looking at it through a pure ideological or public opinion lens.
Yeah, no, and that's perhaps more true in Alberta than anywhere else at this juncture. So cool.